Ukraine, free the political prisoners now! Ukraine, free the political prisoners now! Free Anatoly Slobodyanik now!
Free the Ukrainian political prisoners now! Every year, if not weekly, protesting the fascist murder on May 2nd, 2014 of 46 anti-fascist activists in Odessa. These activists, as you probably know, were corralled in a trade union center building in Odessa, which was set afire by the fascists, and the 46 and others were forced to jump out of the building in order to save their lives. And when they landed below, they were set upon by fascist thugs who proceeded to kill people. 46 in all died that day. Since that day, in that square, in Odessa, their families and friends have been protesting the fascist policies of the Ukrainian government. This year alone, the persecution of those protesters has increased. The parents of the murdered anti-fascist fighters have been imprisoned by the Ukrainian government, and you have their names on the placards that we are carrying today in front of the Ukrainian embassy or consulate in San Francisco. Today, Steve Zeltzer and I'm Jeff Mackler from the United National Anti-War Coalition, delivered a letter personally to the Consul General or his representative, asking him to forward that letter to the President of Ukraine, demanding an end to the government repression in that country, especially against the relatives and supporters of the who were killed by the fascists on May 2nd. Our demonstration today is simultaneous with the action called around the world for April 10th in solidarity with the repressed Ukrainian people. Today there are demonstrations in 18 cities and 12 countries around the world with the exact same message that we have brought to the Ukrainian consulate today. We will not rest until the repression ends and the Ukrainian people are free. As you know, in 2014, a fascist-led coup with the support of the European Union and the United States on a false flag pretext stormed the Ukrainian parliament, or the Rada, installed their own government, kicked out the official government of the country and forced the president to flee. And one of their first actions was to pass legislation obliterating the right of Russian people to speak their own language, a significant group, a majority. So, thank you very much for coming today. We're going to picket for about a half hour. We've delivered the letter. We were going to use the U.S. Postal Service, headed by Dave Welsh, but he was detained by traffic. So, we'd like the representatives of the groups here today to say a few words in solidarity with the Odessa Solidarity Committee, in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and in opposition to the fascist policies permitted by the Ukrainian government with the support of the United States and the European Union.
The Odessa Solidarity Campaign has called for an International Day of Solidarity with the people of Odessa, which is in the Ukraine, on today, April 10th, to draw attention to the Ukrainian government's repression of anti-fascist activists in that city. April 10th marks the day in 1944 when Odessa was liberated from years of fascist occupation, including the German army of Hitler. On this April 10th, representatives of the Odessa Solidarity campaign are delivering a letter to the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C., saying, call, free all political prisoners. Free all political prisoners now. Free all political prisoners now. Free all political prisoners now. And stop the repression of anti-fascists in Odessa. The same letter is being delivered to Ukrainian embassies and consulates in 19 cities in 12 countries. So this is truly an international endeavor that you're part of, sisters and brothers. February 2014 saw the overthrow of the elected president of Ukraine in a violent right-wing coup supported by the US government. Down with the coup regime! Down with the coup regime! Down with the coup regime! Just 3 months later after the coup, hey brother, just 3 months later after the coup, Odessa experienced one of Europe's worst civil disorders in many decades. And it's not a civil disorder by the people, it was a civil disorder by the right-wing fascists. When 46, mostly young progressives, 70% of them were young, 30% of them were over the hill, were brutally murdered when a fascist-led mob set fire to Odessa's House of Trade Unions in Kulikovo Square. Ever since that day, relatives, friends, and supporters of those who were killed have been demanding an international investigation into the massacre. Investigate the massacre now! Investigate the massacre now! Investigate the massacre now! Investigate the massacre now! This obstruction by the Ukrainian government has been noted by the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and other international bodies. I'd like to introduce George Wright, noted professor, academician.
I represent the United Public Workers for Action, and the United Public Workers for Action is in solidarity with the Odessa Solidarity Committee, and we are strongly in solidarity with the political prisoners in Odessa. Our slogan is, US, get your bloody hands off the Ukrainian workers and people. Free Alexander Kushnarev and Anatoly Slobodyanik now. Stop the repression against relatives and supporters of the 46 people murdered on May 2nd, 2014. The coup that the US orchestrated was part of the United States' ongoing project of militarily encircling Russia with the objective of overthrowing President Vladimir Putin, installing a pro-Western regime in the Kremlin, and dismantling Russia while eventually gaining absolute hegemony over Eurasia. The drive for imperialist war to solve the problems of capitalism is the real cause of the growing crisis and threats against Russia and Ukraine. U.S. workers must demand the withdrawal of all U.S. troops and CIA who are training fascists not only in Ukraine but throughout Eastern Europe. The real enemies are at home with the racists, gangsters, and criminals running the U.S. government and the billionaires who they represent. The drive to privatize and loot the economy of Ukraine by the U.S. is also connected to the attack on U.S. workers. U.S. capitalists like VP Joe Biden's son were involved in taking over the energy industry in Ukraine. The need to unify US and Ukrainian workers against neo-fascists is critical. Free all political prisoners in Odessa. Free all political prisoners in Ukraine. Thank you.
No to fascism in Ukraine and all over the world. Now.
I represent the Freedom Socialist Party, and the Freedom Socialist Party stands in solidarity with the families of the 46 murdered anti-fascist activists and those now imprisoned by the Ukrainian government. Tragically, the Ukraine is caught between two imperialist powers with fascists on both sides. And we know that fascist thuggery arises in times of severe economic capitalist crisis, which is what is happening in Ukraine, whose economy has never recovered since the 2008 international crash. What we see is the same thing that we see throughout Europe with the rise of neo-Nazi organizations throughout the continent and here in the United States. In the 1990s, the Freedom Socialist Party helped to organize the United Front Against Fascism in the Pacific Northwest. And after 10 years of direct confrontation, we convinced the likes of Aryan nations and white Aryan resistance that they were not going to set up a white supremacist homeland in the Northwest. And we did that by building a united front and by organizing mass, militant, direct counter demonstrations. And we're at a time in our history where we need to do this again. In the United States, to defend the victims or the targets of fascism, here in Ukraine, in Europe, and around the world. Thank you.
I'm speaking in solidarity with the comrades in Odessa against fascism and for the liberation of the brothers who are now incarcerated, who are family members of the people who were killed in the Odessa massacre in 2014. What I wanted to talk about, though, was, a lot of people right now are already calling the Trump regime fascist. Well, we think that may be a little bit too premature, but we have to look at who actually was in power and supported the fascist takeover in the Ukraine, and it was the Democrats who were in power at the time, and Clinton had a role in this as well. And so, it's important to recognize that the interests of U.S. imperialism don't change whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans that are in power. They are trying to promote imperialist hegemony around the world, and the whole support of the fascists in Ukraine was around bringing NATO right on the Russian border. Was the attempt at doing that. And so we stand in total solidarity. We have been, Workers' World Party has solidly supported the Odessa rebels, and we are in total solidarity with the family and the supporters of the Odessa folks who are fighting against the fascists in Ukraine to this day.
The official State Department policy is that the police, under the direction of the president of the country, Yanukovych, ordered his soldiers and policemen to open fire on a peaceful crowd. They supposedly were on the top of buildings. Innocent people were killed, according to the U.S. account. But the truth finally came out when the U.S. representative to the European Union emailed and said, no, it was not Yanukovych who shot the innocent people, it was the fascist thugs. That story was never told, but it was used as a pretext by the fascists. Sound familiar today with Syria? In order to storm the Rada take over the government, establish a rump parliament, throw out the existing government, and immediately begin to pass repressive laws against Russian language speaking people. And they put in power at the head of the army and police force open fascist groups like the head of the right sector. Next, I should tell you, you've heard about these peaceful protests in the Maidan. Yes, they started out in the Maidan as peaceful protests. But imagine a peaceful protest with Senator John McCain speaking in the United States on the official platform of the fascist right sector. Imagine U.S. government officials passing out cookies as they did to the protesters. Imagine radicals and revolutionaries trying to distribute their own literature in Maidan, and they were beaten, their literature was torn up, and they were driven out of the Maidan Square. These events in the Ukraine are typical of the kind of false flag pretext that the United States uses to install governments that defend the interests of American imperialism.
My name is Steve Zeltzer. I'm speaking as a producer of KPFA Radio, Workweek Radio, that does programming on labor. And what is happening today in Ukraine is a travesty, a crime against working people. Because, in fact, the United States was involved in the overthrow of the Ukrainian government for the purpose of privatizing the wealth of Ukraine. As they were involved in the destruction of the Soviet Union and Russia and privatizing its economy, Jeffrey Sachs was involved in a lottery to divide up the wealth of the Russia. And where did that wealth end up? It ended up in the oligarchy in Russia that Putin represents. So Putin is really a product of the United States conspiracy against Russia. That's who the oligarchy represents in Russia. But the United States, on the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution in 1917, the United States has plans to overthrow Putin. They've surrounded Russia. They have NATO troops, U.S. troops in Poland, thousands of U.S. troops. They are training fascists not only in the Ukraine, but other countries, Moldova and other countries. They are working to set up military fascist regimes. So I think that we can also say that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are jointly involved in this. They both support so-called freedom in Ukraine. Well, what was that freedom? The U.S. ambassador actually announced that she had decided who the new president of Ukraine was going to be from email. What kind of democracy is it when the United States decide who the president of the Ukraine is? Is that democracy, or is that a U.S. installed dictator in Ukraine? That's what we're talking about here. And we in the United States are building solidarity with the Ukrainian workers because they are the ones that are suffering. They privatized pensions. They've stolen the wealth. They're attacking the workers, the social benefits of the workers. And these right-wing fascists who now control the Ukrainian army have cut off coal from the Donbass. Now, who would that affect? That would affect the poor people, the working people of Ukraine. This is a provocative, reactionary, fascistic action which is moving the world towards world war. And we also have to say today at this protest at the Ukrainian consulate that the United States is pushing for war with Russia, and this bombing in Syria is an example again of a conspiracy by the United States. Why would the Assad and the Syrian government actually let off a gas attack when they are winning the war against ISIL and the reactionary terrorists? This was a provocation. Turkey and Israel were involved in that provocation. This was worked out by the United States as a frame-up against Assad. Now, I don't support Assad, but we cannot support U.S. imperialist intervention. We cannot support the effort to divide up Syria, which is what the Trump administration wants to do. One of his assistants wrote up, he drew a little map of 3 parts, the partitioning of Syria. Who would benefit from that but U.S. imperialism? So this is what we're talking about. This is why in the labor movement in the United States we have to educate workers and unions against intervention in Syria. against intervention in Ukraine, to demand the release of the political prisoners in Ukraine, and lastly, the assassinations that took place at the Odessa Trade Union House. This was a crime against not only workers, but against humanity. The Trade Union House in Odessa was a target, and Molotov cocktails were prepared by fascists to be used to murder people. The United States government is silent about it. The United States government is part of the cover-up, Democrats and Republicans. So let's be clear, the Democrats and Republicans from Clinton and Trump have blood on their hands. They now have blood on their hands. They're hands off the Ukrainian working class. For a workers' government and workers' power in Ukraine and in the United States, we need a workers' party here to really represent the working class.
My name's Roger Stoll, and I'm part of the community that supports the Task Force on the Americas. It's usually called the Marin Interfaith Task Force on the Americas, and although our focus is exclusively...
It is on. Okay, I guess you'll have to speak very loud.
Okay, is that working? Okay. I'm Roger Stoll. I'm part of the community of people that supports the Task Force in the Americas, which is also known as the Marin Interfaith Task Force in the Americas. And our focus is Latin America and the Caribbean, and our mission is to educate Americans about what the U.S. is doing in that part of the world. Although I'm not authorized to speak for the task force, I have to say that there was a meeting yesterday, and we can't help discussing things like Syria and the rest of the world because the bloody hand of the U.S., which we focus on in Latin America and the Caribbean, is really everywhere, including in the Ukraine. And I wanted to give a message of solidarity from Latin America solidarity activists. Thank you.
BMs and communication links with B-52s. I worked in SAC headquarters, and I'll tell you what the United States and its allies, Britain and others, are doing, pushing NATO bases closer to the Russian border, is a drive to weaken a regional power. That's part of the National Security Directive of the United States government under Bush. They have a special presidential directive to keep any regional power from being able to deter the U.S. power. So they are attempting to weaken Russia, they're attempting to weaken China. This whole thing of NATO going east, this is all part of a plan by the deep state, of the United States to weaken Russia and then also China. They're surrounding China. This is not a mistake, what they're doing in Ukraine, and we could have Trump turn on a dime and all of a sudden start to give lethal weaponry to the fascist-inspired government of the Ukraine. $60 billion of our taxpayer dollars, American taxpayer dollars, 60 million, I think it's 60 billion, correct myself, went for years to support the so-called color revolutions, to overthrow governments in Eastern Europe that were close to Russia and put in governments favorable to the United States, Britain, and France. So essentially, we've been intervening for decades in the Middle East. Excuse me, in the Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It's hard to keep them all together because we're intervening all over the world. But I'll tell you, as a former Air Force veteran, I'm very concerned right now about having missiles pointed at Russia in Poland. I'm very concerned about a nuclear task force heading to North Korea right now. I'm very concerned that last Friday, the Americans and the Russians stopped their communication about their fighter jets going back and forth over Syria. They're not talking to each other. You can have a screw-up real easy. Just like there was a screw-up, some Serbian nationalists killed the Archduke Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That started World War I. A screw-up by a couple individuals who was a nationalist. This thing could go up very fast. And what we're talking about, these H-bombs, ain't nothing like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These H-bombs will, the whole northern hemisphere will be turned into a fireball, and we'll have nuclear winter for 3 years. So I think it's incumbent on every American, every human being on the planet to stop this war machine from heading to overthrow Syria, because really what they're after, the shadow government of the United States is after to overthrow the Iranian regime. They have not given up to containing or overthrowing the Iranian regime since the Iranian Revolution. And they've tried to split Syria off from Iran. They've been trying all kind of pressures, hasn't worked. So now I think they're in the mode of overthrow, regime change in Syria, and to weaken. And the U.S. is in bed with Saudi Arabia, all the oil kingdoms in the Persian Gulf, Turkey, Britain, they all support overthrowing the Iranian regime, overthrowing the Syrian regime. Wait, okay, I'll end. Senator Fulbright wrote a book during the Vietnam War called The Arrogance of Power. We got the arrogance of power, of American power, and we have a crazed leadership of the American government that can lead us to a nuclear inferno on this planet. That's why we got to get our ass in gear and stop the war makers.
Ukrainian political prisoners now.
Stop the repression against the people of Eastern Ukraine.